binge watching later. And of
Well,
course,
we
feel
need
free
Amanda to take notes after the fact.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Good point. And I encourage everyone to put their cameras on if you so choose. Nice to see everyone's face. So we really have a couple of things we're going to do today. One is talk a little bit about sort of where 2021 is headed, and then what we're going to be doing in 2022, just as kind of teeing it up for actually next week, and as we start to look forward to the next phases of what we'll be doing here. Adam will take us through the initial sort of marketing strategy, communication, dissemination strategy for the consent scan, and I'm going to steal all the thunder and say we are good to go. So we're going to start disseminating it. So we'll talk more about that, and then you know, on the half hour-ish, we'll have our friends from Interoperability Institute, Mahin, and Interop community talk about MELD and how that plays in, what they're doing on that, and what the opportunities of that we've been talking about relative to consent scan utility and other things that are related to the work of Unify. A couple of other headlines along the way. And I think we have, generally, we just introduce new people here. And I think the only new person here is Root No Goto. So I've got that right. So we, our tradition here is to have you say hello, where you're from, what interests you, just for a couple of minutes. So if you'd like to do that, we'd love to hear about you. Hey, greetings. There you go. No, still can't hear you. Anyone hear you? Try it again. Third time's the charm.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Great. I'm a graduate student in Great Valley State and interning at the Interoperability Institute as a intern. Yes. So that's how I got to join the meeting today. Yeah.
Oh, great. So hopefully they'll have told you if you're going to present any of the slides. So we'll see and how kindly Stephanie and company treat you. Well, we're watching. Welcome aboard. Great that you can make it.
Thank you.
Great, welcome. So just two quick things. One, actually, really one thing I just wanted to note is there's two conferences happening this week that I'm aware of that some of our team has been participating in. One is the RWJF All-In Conference, or annual event, which has been the last 3 days or so. And a number of folks have been on different sessions there. A lot of examples from all across the country, a lot of different topics. We've assembled a kind of a tracking sheet and a worksheet. Everybody who's going to it, they were generous and they gave us registration. They waived the fee for registration. So folks who have gone to sessions, they're just kind of writing up their notes so we can share it. A bunch of good stuff on a whole range of different topics. I sat in on one on MPIs just earlier today, and one California county that figured it out for themselves across everything. And I know there's a bunch of different ones on there. So we'll just have a couple minutes of conversation on that. And then if Amanda joins us later, if not, we'll send out a link to that. It's a good resource for anyone who's interested in that particular topics. And
let me, Daniel, let me interrupt because I don't think it was clear what the link would be. So we're going to put the notes from various sessions into SharePoint. So you didn't have to go and you don't have to watch the rerun. We will provide notes if there's something there that interests you. You know, read away. If you need access to SharePoint, do send a note to Amanda. But we want to be able to, you know, provide materials like this for the group that so generously volunteers their time. So this is an example of the kind of resource we want to be. So we've set up a folder in SharePoint, and the notes from these sessions will be in it. And that's what you'll get a link to.
And I think they'll probably post everything online. I'm pretty sure it's
Sure
all
they will.
open posted. So they do a good job curating a lot of different topics. I sat in on one session. I just showed on the screen. This is the largest grouping of foundations that I've ever seen come together that I never knew about. Unbelievable. And apparently they've been meeting for a while. It really caught my eye was this idea of systems approach. And that's a lot about what we're talking about, of course. And to see, these are all the major foundations from Rockefeller to, it just goes across the entire gambit to all of the banking foundations and amazing groups of folks. And I sat through a couple of them, and it was pretty fascinating to hear people now beginning at the foundation level thinking about how they're collaborating and coordinating some of their efforts, which is about time. But much like the rest of the industry, they go off in their own directions and create a lot of different dissonance. But there's interesting resources here, and they do have a focus as well on health. So I've made some contact with them and hope we can get their involvement, their engagement with our work as we go forward, because it's really kind of the scalable stuff they're talking about here, and thinking about it from an equitable framework, of course, as well. So I'll provide a link to that as in the notes as well for that. But that was pretty cool. Brian, do you want to say anything about any of the sessions that you were at briefly, and then kind of go into the plan? We can pivot over to that.
Sure. I sat in on the all-in community information exchange and equity meeting, as well as the master person index breakout group and a resource directory breakout group. I took diligent notes, but I can't say that the CIE equity breakout really resonated with me. But the master person from a technical perspective, it wasn't really that kind of a presentation. But the master person index presentation earlier on today was a great in the weeds. Here are the problems that we ran into trying to do person matching between multiple different systems. Here's what we found didn't work. Here's what we found that did work. And in the follow-on discussions, there were also some contributions from members of the audience for how to not only what algorithms to make use of, but in person matching, but also how to solve the problem of associating an individual with a family or with a household, which are equally challenging problems in person matching. So I've invited the original presenter to either contribute her slides for us to share amongst ourselves, or perhaps even to make a presentation to us in the coming months. Maybe even get involved in the person matching work. You're forewarned, Dave. She's a very nice person, but also has some really exceptional experience in providing common sense solutions to some of the person matching problems. And the resource directory presentation was really Greg Bloom, and who is one of the founders. He is the founder of Open Referral, talking about the future for resource directories, specifically standards-based resource directories, but also not just the wonders of the wonderful world of standards, but once you have the standards in place, what models would work for creating sustainable directories? Because it costs something to maintain, curate, and keep updated directories of various service providers in a community. So that was a fascinating one. I'd highly recommend taking a look at my notes for for these, as well as for the CIE one. Even though it didn't resonate with me, I still made sure to take copious notes on what was going on. With regard to Unify planning for 2022, we're not going to do that today, but I wanted to give everybody a heads up that after this meeting, Amanda will be sending out a couple of slides for planning. One that tries to do a summary or recap of what we've gotten done in the last year or so. I think I have it listed as 2021 deliverables, but in fact, I think we've managed to deliver those over the course of the tail end of 2020 and much of 2021. We still have a few more things to get done for 2021. But then I also have a slide that talks about, and by the way, can I just share for a minute, Daniel?
Yeah,
do
go
not
ahead.
have that.
Yeah.
Let me just give folks a heads up. Can you see my full screen here?
Yep.
Okay. I can't, but mostly because everybody's faces are now in front of it. Oh, well. So this is homework for next week. Next week, we're going to do a special feature topic on 2022 planning. And also, you know, where are we going to go next with consent? So take a look at these slides, see what I've screwed up, see what you think needs to be added in for 2021 deliverables, or for, you know, the proposed 2022 deliverables. Think of this as a roadmap for where we're going to go in the coming year. And this is just a draft for us to play with, not a fait accompli. So take a look at what arrives in your inbox from Amanda later on today, or early tomorrow, depending on just where she is right now, and provide feedback to the group, to me personally, to Daniel, to whomever, and we'll try to update the slide deck for next week. And next week we'll dig into, what does this mean? Where do we really want to go in the coming year? And that's it. I'm done, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Brian. And a lot of what Brian shows here, a lot of the focus, pragmatically speaking, is on, you know, the consent, disseminating the scan going into 2022, and then going and doing it a couple of places. And both, you know, New York and New Jersey are both, you know, still at the plate, and we'll hear as we go through today, both from what Adam will talk about a little bit on the scan just in a second, and then what Ed and Stephanie and Mary will talk about in terms of MELD. How do we begin to prepare for the eventual sort of POC focused on, you know, using and focused on, you know, synthetic data for ink-related sites. So real places, real stuff, real leading, cutting, bleeding edge stuff. So with this community and others who are coming together. So very exciting and really looking forward to it. And that conversation around 2022, of course, needs to be put in a realistic context of resources, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, good point, Dan. Yeah, we don't necessarily. Part of it depends on how much and what kinds of resources can be brought together to maintain this work and to sustain and move it forward. And that's stuff that we're going to want to talk about, because there's a lot of opportunities that are emerging and evolving. How quickly they'll be able to be brought to bear. We really, you know, the last couple of years since COVID, since we started this work, it's been about practical implementation. What can we actually do, and not just come up with a billion kind of idea recommendations, which are great, but there's just a lot of recommendations. Which is the one thing that the slide of the great present, you know, all those foundations coming together. My concern with them and other foundation support and how we move forward is that they're still creating new stuff as opposed to sort of implementation oriented in 2022, 2023. during this administration with the momentum that's already out there. And so the question is, how quickly can they and others move to really take advantage of the real-time, real immediate momentum. And so that means, what are you not going to do, right? To your point, Adam, what are the one or two things we can actually do? And putting this consent scan together was a direct flow out from the National Action Agenda, which many of you participated on for the prior year. So we're heading in that direction. So we're very clear about where we're headed. The question is, how much can we do? How quickly can we do? How many people can be involved? And can we actually make a difference? So with that, let me ask Adam to give us a preview of what we're going to be doing with the scan.
Yep, thank you. Do I have control?
Yes, you should.
Okay, great. So I'll start where I always do and thank everybody who's participated, because we couldn't have done it without you. And the document really, truly reflects your expertise. It's something very different from anything I've ever worked on, that's for sure. And I won't advise anybody to have 25 authors of anything in the future, but I think that it works, and it works quite well. Daniel, did you? Oh, we'll get to your announcement. Let me share screen here. So I'm going to make this brief. What I would like very much is to, hold on, I'm having trouble sharing screen. Okay. Does everybody see it?
Coming.
Slideshow from beginning.
Yeah.
Now we see it.
There you go. You see it? I'm
Yep.
getting all kinds of offers from Microsoft and for live captions and subtitles that I can do in the future. Okay, does everybody see the slide?
Yeah, click the got it, because that's right in the middle of the screen.
Oh, you see it. Okay,
And we also see your notes, so you may want to just show presentation.
I don't have any notes, so that's okay.
Okay.
But I'm not sure why it's not showing full screen. Anyway, it's okay. I don't care. So we've done the consent project. Here's slide one. This is very simple. What I was going to say is that I don't want to spend much time on this at all. But when we get to the last slide, what I'm hoping for is some real discussion about what do we do now? Okay, we did a report. Isn't it wonderful? We're going to publish it. It's great. But if the world doesn't know about it, and if we don't have plans in place to actually run with it, then we need another shelf for another report. And we would like for it not to wind up in that condition. So this is, where are we? The scan is done, the report's finished. We've written a blog and a newsletter that are ready to go as soon as we actually post and have something to link to and announce. And as of the time that I wrote this PowerPoint, this fifth bullet was correct. Our WJF sign-off is imminent, so dissemination is likely to start next week. And Daniel got a little news right after I finished putting this together.
Bada boom. No,
Bada boom.
Yeah. So I spoke with Hillary, and they're good with it. They're good with it, and so which is always great. You always want to have a foundation support, especially when you're acknowledging their brand and their support. So we're good to go with that, which has been really the last hurdle before we send it out. And it's been really hard not to send it out. So many people have worked on it and asked for it. So we're going to start to do that now. And we'll actually send everybody on the call here. And then, well, the thing that you didn't mention, Adam, also is we're also doing some technical work on the websites, so people can go in and link to it and open it up there as well. So that takes a little more.
We're preparing in various ways.
Yeah.
So the one thing just to add to what Daniel said was that Hillary, our program officer, did indeed sign off, but she also said some pretty effusive stuff about the work. So,
right.
That counts too. And then the last,
Congratulations to both of you for putting that together, and that's great. And I bet you it's definitely be worth the wait, waiting for their official approval. I think that's great and a real reinforcement to what we all have accomplished.
yeah, and you know, her kudos about the report are really very much kudos to all of you. I mean, that's for real. Okay, and the next slide contains suggestions. So we plan to really pull the stops on this. You know, Daniel will be making his infamous phone calls to everyone on earth. And we'll be sending out emails and the newsletter and the blog, and we're going to be doing everything we can to take next steps. And again, we want to hear from you. We don't need to, and we don't want to take those steps ourselves. We've done this as a collaboration, open source, open everything operation from the get-go. And so as we look at the next slide, which has some suggestions on what others can do to help get the word out, to get real next steps going, keep in mind some of those can and should involve some of you. You know, it isn't just you giving your input on what stewards can do. Hopefully, most or all of this can be done in collaboration with many of you. So please keep that in mind as you think about what else can be done. So we want to start spreading the news, and here's some suggestions that we've come up with on ways we can do that, or the ways that you can do that. And we'll get to the next slide, which will say, what are we missing? So what I'd love for you to do is, when we get to the discussion, if there are any suggestions on, you know, I would change blogs to something else. You know, if you don't have a newsletter, what are some of the specifics of how people can participate, how people can help to get the word out? We want your input on this. This is an initial list to throw out some ideas. So for blog, and Daniel has generously volunteered me to, you know, I'm the communications guy here and with stewards, and I'll be here to help anybody who wants to work on any of these, to strategize or to write or edit. If somebody wants a hand to get it done, we want to help get it done. So you can write your own blog from the perspective of your own work. You can use Daniel's as a guest blog once you see it. And so blogging is certainly one way. Newsletters, if you have one, however, whatever format fits, whatever length of content works for you. We're going to do a launch webinar. Actually, Daniel, before I forget, you gave me a date for the launch webinar and I didn't write it down. So it's a Friday something. The Friday before you leave, perhaps?
No, I think it's mid-December.
It's
We've
okay.
had it-
We
now
will
that-
get you a date.
Yeah.
We are planning our own webinar to launch this thing, and we'll invite some of you to participate as well. And we have a whole bunch. They're listed in the report itself under recommendations. We list the other webinars that we would like to organize and run during the course of the next steps. That'll be contingent on some funding, which we are hopeful about, but the plans are getting in place. And if you do webinars, if your organization does webinars, you know, one on consent and or the report would make lots of sense to us, and we'd love to participate and help organize it if that's helpful. Podcasts would be fun. I think everybody might have one before we all die. But right now only half the population has them. And some of them, I've done some Googling, really are right on target. I mean, they're about information exchange, they're about ethical practices in healthcare, they're about a whole lot of topics that this work fits into. It really, really does. And so if you do one of those podcasts, or you know someone who does, or you've listened to one that you think, oh boy, that this would work really well in it, let us know. We would love to do that. It's a nice new way to get the word out for us. We have not done it before, but I think it could be genuinely useful. And we'll just a few more. Through social media, we certainly would be grateful if anybody and everybody just put out once the link is up, just put out the word that the link is up, that this work with hopefully with a few words from you, pointing people to it and talking about its importance. That will certainly be helpful. Introductions. We know lots of folks, Daniel knows lots of folks, but we don't know everybody. And this is a time when, if we're going to take action, we need to have people on board who can help us take that action. And so if there's an organization, a funder, a potential partner in some consent work, another implementation site, introductions are very, very welcome. The more people we know, the more we can get this into the world, the better the prospects are for actually doing something with it. And finally, the last bullet point, the one I warned you about earlier, we would love to generate a little discussion here now of what people think is right and wrong on these suggestions that we give you. But more importantly, are there other ideas that you have for how do we get this into the world? How do we actually do the work so that a year from now, we're not just lamenting that it's on another shelf, but are planning yet another year of successful work that implements the recommendations that we all came up with. And with that, a volunteer of who wants to give their 2 cents first, or Daniel will call on you.
I'm known to do that.
No, I know you're not going to do that.
So I think one of the things we're going to do also is well, you can marinate on this, think about it, and next week, along with our 2022 planning, we're going to spend a little time. Well, we should be in process by then. Things should be going out. Our system should be, sort of ready to go. You'll have seen or you'll receive the, both the newsletter and the different stuff. You yourself, or maybe you in connection with your communications person, should you have one, you may want to bring them to the meeting. You may want to think about clarifications, or if you have questions about, specific things, maybe one or two commitments to do. We can talk about that next week, because the part that's important is what we're going to do over the next 2 months or 3 months, right? So we're going into holidays. People are tired, taking a break. So we want to just, there's urgency to it before the end of the year, but we want to come into 2022 with having, started to make some noise and get the word out. So that's that. I'm frankly, I don't need to sort of brainstorm now unless anybody has got a great idea too, because I know we want to get to Meld and our friends at Interoperability Institute. So if somebody
let me underscore something before we hand off. So we think it's important to get this out. I mean, it's been lingering for so long. And so we really want to do it next week, because it's the window, before Thanksgiving, and then everything sort of people scatter to the winds. But those 2 months between next week and the end of the year are the time we would love for you guys to help in the ways that you can. Feel free to send me an email if you plan to do any of these, or if you have questions or suggestions, please do send it. And then we will hopefully, after the launch next week, keep a real flow of communications going over time, so this thing has some momentum, honest momentum, going into the new year.
Super.
Okay. And stop sharing. And thank you, everybody, yet again.
And I want to thank you for your persistence and professionalism and really bringing this together. It's been, for everyone who knows who worked with Adam, it's been a daunting experience, and but it's something I think I'm really delighted and honored to have my name on it along with you all. So hopefully I'll feel that way. And with that, Ed, we've got Ed, Stephanie, and Mary. I don't know if I can spotlight all three of you all, and I'm not sure who's, Stephanie, are you showing, are you going to run the slides?
The,
I can
Daniel,
run the slides, Mary, if you'd like.
yep, Mary's gonna,
Mary, you're on mute.
do the speaking and Stephanie will present the slides.
Great. So just one quick thing, Mary, and for everyone, we've been, working and talking and thinking about how to bring our efforts together over the last several years and participation. So today is a great opportunity to kind of take a step forward and say, this is work that's happening in parallel, and I think has a lot of applications to the work we've been doing and the direction we're headed. So we'll get into more conversation about what that might look like. And I guess, again, I got to give you control here, I think. Okay, I'm going to make you guys, oh, you got it. Okay, great.
I was gonna say, I think I have control.
Yeah, you do, great.
Can you see the slides? Okay,
Yep.
fantastic. I'll turn it over to Mary. Mary, just let me know when to
Wonderful.
advance.
Well, thank you all for the opportunity to share with you some of the recent dialogue. As Daniel said, there is a new and emerging community collaboration. I think individually, many of us have discussed some of these activities at various levels. Delighted to be here. Interoperability Institute, I think since the start of the Project Unify proof of concept, has been helping to support our team and with our sandbox environment and synthetic data. So today's conversation is both a status update and an open dialogue with all of us as a community as to how we might be able to take some of these resources and the activities under Project Unify forward. So please allow me to introduce the team from Interoperability Institute. We pulled out all the stops today. In the interest of time, I will just introduce briefly with title. First is Ed Daniels from Point of Care Partners. It's been a delight working with Ed and the national leadership that he and the team at Point of Care Partners are providing in the area of electronic consent. Stephanie Arnston, who is often a member of Project Unify and often a participant, has been working with Dave Walsh and with Stewards of Change, and delighted that Stephanie, as our lead for our industry engagement team, is here, joined by Kendra Bates. Kendra will be providing us with a technology demo today, the technology resources that Interoperability Institute is contributing to Project Unify. Joining Kendra is our senior product engineer, Oliver Ron. I know the technical folks who've worked on standing up the proof of concept have worked with Oliver and appreciate his technical depth and breadth. Amber Weeks, who is the lead for our synthetic data activities. And last but not least, Rutundo Gotu, who is one of our student associates. She is working with Chuck Friedman's group at the University of Michigan, obtaining her advanced degree in medical informatics, and has been providing that academic connection to building out resources and being able to enable some of the technology on the Sandbox platform, in addition to making sure that it is well positioned for learning environments. Did I miss anybody, team? Quite an inventory. Very good. So what we wanted to share today was about 6 months ago, Interoperability Institute came together with Integrating the Healthcare Enterprise, IHE USA, which is activity that closely aligns with the HIMSS group. Qvera, that is a cloud-based data hub solution Red Hat, who's well known for their activities with open source communities and Linux, of course. Interopion, that is a company that has initiated a sandbox environment for the HL7 community and work on Smart on Fire. And then the business processing modeling for health, BPM Plus, which does is a community within the object management group with expertise in standing up business process models. They actually have taken for electronic consent, the patient journey very much on the healthcare side, and put together the standard artifacts for computable objects for the patient journeys for all component pieces of the business process in the patient's journey for electronic consent. Very, very powerful when you combine that with a demonstration. So have come together and stood up the interop community. You can just go to the domain name, interop community, an emerging collaboration to advance healthcare interoperability and a focus on social determinants of health using open platforms and open source software. Next slide, please. So the interop community has a governance structure that is for the initial standing up of the community. And as part of that, we are planning to put forward multiple communities of practice. In a community of practice, this well-versed group, I don't need to read the slide, but similar to Project Unify, we all have a passion for bringing solutions, for bringing that e-consent utility, for being able to bridge interoperability between health and human services. So under the governance structure, a community of practice puts forward a membership petition, and there is a certain amount of low barrier thresholds, but things that need to be done to remit, what the standard modus operandus, you need to have at least 2 chairs, at least 3 entities that are passionate about standing up a community, and you need to resource that activity. I'll kick over the comments on this slide. We kind of go back and forth between interop community, what we're doing with some of the sandbox and synthetic data resources, and this process to stand up a community of practice. Ed Daniels has been taking a leadership role in standing up the e-consent community of practice. So Ed, did I miss anything there? I know you've been spearheading the process and helping us to mature the governance model for the interop community.
Yeah, I just want to say that, you know, as we've talked about with this group, we've been putting together the e-consent collaborative with a focus more on the advanced care planning side of things. And we are planning, or we have actually petitioned to become a community of practice within the interop community. And hopefully at some point, Project Unify will also want to participate and potentially petition to become a community of practice within the interop community. So, and that focus would be more on social determinants and human services, et cetera. So anyway, that's all for discussion, but I just wanted to open that up as a topic for future discussion.
Thank you, Ed. Can we move to the next slide, please? So wanted to share with this group the resources that we're bringing to Project Unify. The Interoperability Institute initially had a private, non-open source sandbox environment, which we contributed in kind to Project Unify. Interop community, we've stood up an open source sandbox called MELD. Oliver Strong is the lead technical resource for the MELD sandbox. And Oliver, I'll kick it over to you to go through the litany of technologies on this slide. And for the audience, please, if you have any questions about what we built here and what we're contributing to Project Unify, please feel free to ask. Oliver, over to you.
Sure, thanks, Mary. So if we look at here, we've covered the big pieces of the modern healthcare infrastructure here. So it's FHIR oriented. We support sandboxes, indeed STU2, STU3, R4, and the current R5 draft, wherever it stands. There is synthetic patient data, about 1,000 patients or so for each of those, and the supporting resources. We have import, export for an entire sandbox for all of the FHIR records built in. I know you can do it from the API. We got a pretty technical team here, but it is pretty handy for some of the less technical people to get engaged. We have a patient data manager application that's also pretty handy to create some quick data on the fly, edit, tweak. We've taken the applications from kind of a less organized approach of just hand instantiating and configuring applications and resources in AWS to build it entirely on Kubernetes. We have CI/CD now to build them, move the images into the Amazon container registry, and it's all defined very well now in a Helm chart. So it's very quick to scale. It's very quick to add new services or features in, and it's really quick to stand up a new instance. If somebody wants to do something completely off the current charts, we can stand one of these up in 30 minutes instead of a couple of weeks now. On top of that, we've got the risk chart app. We got CDX hooks in there. We have Smart on FHIR. We have the Inferno validator. So we cover a lot of the big items there.
Thank you, Oliver. And I appreciate the CI/CD. I know, as many in this audience will know, that's quite a lift to do that initial stand up for continuous integration and continuous deployment. And so delighted to hear that that's moved forward. Next slide,
Hey,
please.
Mary.
Oh, yes.
Before we go there, you can leave it here, but you can actually go back a slide if you don't mind. I want to just dwell for a second here while we're at it, because I suspect there are some questions. There may be some reluctant questions, but that's a mouthful. So of stuff that is sort of embedded in the sandbox. So I would just encourage, I have a couple questions, but I would encourage folks to sort of comment a bit as we're thinking about it. We'll come back to it at the later as well, but I'm just curious if other people are like, I'm intrigued by the Kubernetes and the containerized architecture in particular. I've just been learning about that in conversations around Linux and around open source. It seems to me, as we think about replicable, customizable solutions across multiple domains, sectors, and programs, that's a foundational component. But maybe, Oliver, you could just spend like 30 seconds talking about that, or others, because I thought that was one of the more powerful concepts as I've been thinking more about this work.
Yeah, for sure. So if you're not familiar, Kubernetes is a container orchestration layer. So underneath that it is Docker, then underneath that is the compute resources. The great thing about Docker with Kubernetes orchestrating it is all the major cloud platforms support this. If we were to use, for say, we have a great relationship with AWS, but if we were to use AWS's micro or managed services for databases and specific things like that, it's a lot more work. If anybody wants to take this project and contribute, they have to work in AWS. If this isn't most familiar, they need to do a lot of things. AWS makes it easy because we can use things like the container registry and other parts of the pipeline for the deployment and integration testing. But the scalability of vertically and horizontally that we can find with Kubernetes is a huge growth because with these platforms, they're used somewhat sporadically. There's a lot of activity at, say, Connectathon, but there might not be as much or a lot of activity at all for a month or two, and then just a ton. So we can cover that without draining our bank account unnecessarily, or always going in and tweaking settings here and there.
Do you say more about the patient data manager application?
Yeah, so I think Kendra's on the hook for a demo as
Correct.
well.
So yeah, we can go into detail as we go through the demo that Kendra will be providing in short order. I think we have just a couple more framing slides, but there is a question from Brian Handpicker. So is it safe to say the MELD interop community is the next generation of interoperability land environment we used for the Unify demos in the past? Great question, Brian. So interoperability land was initially what Interoperability Institute provided to Project Unify. That is not an open source offering, but is a hosted sandbox environment. What we refer to in the interop community governance model is a private locker. So MELD is public facing, public domain sandbox environment, very appropriate for Project Unify. But as entities take the next step beyond public facing, public domain activities with Project Unify, they may want a private members only hosted sandbox environment. They can take that into the organization to a group that is developing a business process or a business model. And the notion is to build a marketplace around private locker hosted sandbox offerings. Essentially, many organizations have sandboxes today, but at the end of the day, there is cost efficiencies in just enabling a hosted service where you don't have to go through getting your cloud contract, getting your development team, standing it up, loading your data, et cetera, to have a hosted environment where you can go to the AWS marketplace and basically just stand it up is part of the governance structure of interop community to make a sandbox marketplace available for advancing interoperability. Again, many activities that we can do in the public domain, but particularly for private sector companies, not everything may want to be done in the public domain. And so it provides a ready marketplace to advance those activities. Does that address your question, Brian?
Yes, thank you very much.
Cool.
So this group should be very familiar with the consent service utility ecosystem. Love this slide, all the dialogue that we've been having and all of the component pieces. And of course, the industry scan that was completed in the recent publication. Daniel or others, any additional comments about our service utility?
I'd just point out that that Daniel and I worked with Mary and Ed in creating this presentation. They have not misappropriated our pretty picture here.
Thank you, Brian. I will also add, in the Health Information Exchange community, Civitas, formerly Chic, is putting forward, working with Sequoia, the QHINs, the notion of a health data utility, or an HDU, with a particular focus around more and more activities at the consumer engagement level and ultimately personal health records. What does that mean outside of the core infrastructure components? What does that what does that mean for standing up a utility service and how a consumer would engage in that utility. All right, next slide, please. We want to get to the demo because that's the fun part. So just a few quick framing slides. Oh, Daniel, you had a comment? Nope. Okay. So the notion of communities of practice is to add to the open source code base, MELD, basic, robust public domain sandbox. Oliver's team leads the code curation of the MELD sandbox, and to leverage that public domain service that communities of practice, multiple communities of practice, can utilize that resource to enhance healthcare interoperability. Next slide, please. So the electronic consent community of practice will use as an open proving ground for this activity is essentially a concept, right? You might use that proving ground to simulate a specific implementation of a solution. You might use it to innovate on a new solution. You might use it for training. You might use it to validate your data or your business process model. You might use it to collaborate, to come together around a connectathon event. And proving for multiple practice to be able to use as a resource to enable their initiatives. Next slide, please. At long last. So if there are no questions, and please, let's make the demo very interactive. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Kendra Baker to show everyone what this MELD Sandbox resource is. Kendra, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Mary. All right. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So as we mentioned earlier, I'm going to go ahead and show a couple of things that we can see in the MELD Sandbox that we mentioned earlier. Here, what I did was I went ahead and logged into my MELD account, which for anyone on this call, it is extraordinarily easy to make that account. You need a first, last name, and an email. You could go make one right now and it'd probably be good to go in 10 minutes. But the first thing that's going to happen when you log in is you're going to see this page here, and it's going to show all the sandboxes that you have access to. So right now I have access to 4 sandboxes, and another thing that I'm going to be able to do is I'm going to be able to create a sandbox. So if I wanted to create one right now, I could go ahead and name it Project Unify. I'm going to select the FHIR version that I would like my sandbox to use. I'm going to give it an open endpoint, and I'm going to hit create. We'll come back to this. It usually takes somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes, but I'm hoping by the end of the demo, we'll see that this new sandbox is spun up. Another feature that we've implemented into the MELD Sandbox is the ability to import and export entire sandboxes. So if I wanted to export the Kendra demo sandbox, all I have to do is hit this icon. It's going to send me a link in my email, and I'm going to have a copy of the entirety of my sandbox. All the changes to the data, any user information, everything that I need for that sandbox is now going to be in my email address. And with that sandbox, if I was to ever decide to delete it, think I don't need it anymore, I can go ahead and save a copy of it. And all I have to do is re-upload a zip file. Similar to creating a new sandbox, depending on size, it might take a little longer, but it's going to go ahead and re-import the entire sandbox exactly in the state it was when I exported it, which is very, very helpful if you're trying to just make sure that you have a copy of any changes you're making to the data. And also here, just so we can see, the Project Unify sandbox that I made for this demo is already spun up, and that is populated with all the synthetic data that you'll see as I'm going throughout the demo. As we go in and enter any sandbox, this first page we're going to see here is this registered apps page. And the registered apps page are Smart on Fire applications. And here, like we show, we have the Billy Rubin Risk Chart app, which is open source in the CDS Hook sandbox. These applications are able to utilize the synthetic fire data within the sandbox. And we're also able to go ahead and add new Smart on Fire applications. So if you're doing a test scenario, it's requiring that you use a Smart on Fire application specific to whatever that testing scenario is. You can go through and just add in your app name as well as the app launch URI, and then you're able to register that application from within your sandbox. Next, we have the CDS Hook servers. What we're seeing here is an example server. The CDS Hooks demo server is just going to show us that this sandbox is able to connect to the CDS service. So the first thing I have the opportunity to do is select a persona and a patient. And with that, I'm able to get this success card, and that's showing me that my Kendra demo sandbox was able to connect to the CDS server. And with that, I'm going to be able to obtain any of these 5 cards we can see here. So if, for example, I wanted to get a complete medical history, I would select my practitioner persona, select a patient, and it's going to go through and show us all of those cards for all the observations that Daniel here has, and it's going to obtain his complete medical history. And for those who don't know, this is supposed to replicate clinical decision services, which show similar to what a practitioner would see from inside their EHR when they are gathering information about their patient. Another aspect we have about the MELD sandbox that's very helpful are launch scenarios. These are going to be very helpful if a testing scenario is going to require the same situation happening over and over. So for example, if I was to create a new testing scenario, I'm going to decide if I want to do a smart app or a CDS service. I'll do a smart app so I can show you guys what the bilirubin risk chart app looks like. I'm going to need to select the application that I would like to use. I will select the practitioner, or if it is an application that it would be a patient who's using it, you can select a patient persona, but I'll go ahead and select my practitioner, Susan, and then I'm going to need to select a patient. In this case, we'll use Billy Baby because they have enough data. I hit next, confirm all my information is correct, and hit save. I've made this new launch scenario here, and if I hit play, it's going to automatically run through all of that information for me, open up the bilirubin risk chart app, and display all of Billy Baby's data here. Again, this is helpful if you're doing the same thing over and over. You're reducing the time you need to do it because you don't need to manually go in and select a persona, select a patient, select the application. You can just hit one button. Now, I've shown you applications, I've shown you the CDS hooks, but I think one of the most important things about the sandbox is the synthetic data. So this sandbox I'm in here is a FHIR R4 sandbox, and we have around about 100 synthetic patients in here. And if I select any of these patients, I'm going to first see this nice little chart, and this is going to break down what FHIR resources this patient has available. This is available for every single patient, and it's just a helpful way to quickly visualize what you may be working with if you were to say select Daniel to be used in your testing scenario. Now, if you want to get very specific and really dig deep into what resources Daniel has, you can enter the patient data manager. And what this is going to do is show us every single resource Daniel has underneath his file. So here, if we go into his observation resources, we can see a height resource, a weight resource, a heart rate. And we're also able to go ahead and click on any resource and start to look at some more specific aspects of it, such as that it's using a LOINC code, when the effective date time was. All of that wonderful information we're able to obtain right here. And another aspect of the FHIR resources we're able to use within this patient data manager is that I can edit any resource. So for example, here we can see Daniel is 165 centimeters. And in my scenario, I want him to be 150. I change that value. I hit this update button here, and we're going to see that it did update that resource. It's not just updating it in the patient data manager UI, it also updates it in the JSON file of his FHIR resource. If I was to click this icon to view the JSON, it's going to show that right here. We can see it now says 150. We also have the ability to clone a resource if you need a copy, as well as export the JSON. And also, if you want to delete a resource, you can do it with any resource you'd like. You just hit delete, and it's going to go ahead and remove that from Daniel's file. That's very helpful if you are trying to fit a very specific testing scenario. And finally, we're also able to create resources. So if I'd like to create an observation here for Daniel, I click the plus and this box is going to pop up. I need to populate these fields, and I'll hit create, and it's going to just create that resource right in my patient data manager, and it'll generate the JSON for me, which is very helpful. We also have personas within our sandbox. These personas are just going to act as who's using your smart applications or your CDS services. You can see I have Susan, who acts as a practitioner persona, and I have Daniel. Any patients or practitioners within your sandbox can become personas, including those you may import or create by hand. Another great aspect of these sandboxes is the ability to utilize FHIR profiles and FHIR validation. So for this sandbox, what I've done is I went ahead and I uploaded the US core profile into my sandbox. I did that simply by adding the zip package that I got off the US core HL7 FHIR website. And we can see it's gone and it's gathered everything we need from the US core profile. And if I go ahead and navigate to this tools page, we're going to see a couple different ways that I'm going to be able to select resources I'd like to validate. You can upload resources or just copy a JSON, but in this case, what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and select a resource directly out of my patient list within my sandbox. And we'll do Daniel. Then the first thing it's going to do is gather all of Daniel's resources. So if I wanted to just say, run this specific resource, I could. But what I'm going to do here is go ahead and select every single resource Daniel has. And then I'm going to go ahead and select US core profile. As you can see, Daniel doesn't have a ton of resources, so it was pretty quick, but we can see that all of Daniel's resources do comply with US core. We don't have any issues in the validation, and that's going to be very helpful for people whose testing scenario is going to require that they comply with a very specific FHIR profile. For example, many of the different IGs require that you use certain profiles, so it's very helpful to make sure that you're not testing with an incorrect resource. We also, as mentioned, we do have Inferno right here within the sandbox. And then the final thing I'd like to show is this is open source, but every sandbox you make is unique to you and they're completely individual. So as you can see, if I click here, I have 4 sandboxes here. None of them interact. If I delete the Project Unify sandbox, it won't affect any of my other sandboxes. Any of the data edits I make or users I invite are only going to affect the sandbox that I'm in when I make those changes, which is very helpful because you're able to work on multiple projects at one time without being worried that those projects may interfere with one another. And I think that's just about all I have to show. We're happy to answer questions, or if anyone would like to see anything again, please feel free to let me know. I'm happy to do whatever we can do.
Thank you, Kendra. We have a few questions in the chat box. Eric, I can read your question, or Eric Jan. I believe your question related to Kubernetes and Docker might be directed to Oliver. Eric, to you.
Oops, 1 second. Actually, how about I just, I'm going to get feedback, I think. But the question is just technical. Are you sure about Docker and if you're going to continue using that as opposed to just straight Kubernetes or some replacement for it? That's all. It's nothing important for today's.
Yeah, I guess I haven't given it much thought after the big Docker runtime shim is going away in Kubernetes, what, almost a year ago now. I haven't gave it much thought. We'll probably clean things up as we go, but I don't think much consideration's been given to it.
Got it. Thank you.
And the next question from Brian Handpicker related to the patient data manager. Question on if it's open source.
Yep, it is open source. At least the version that it's derived from. We've done some changes and fixes to it, and we're working on getting all of our repositories posted on GitHub. But it's the same one that, if my cat would leave me alone, you can find on the Logica GitHub page. I will find a link and toss it up here.
So it's based on Logica, not on OCP or?
I don't know where they built it from, but a lot of the bones of MELD are based on the Logica open source code base.
Thank you.
And a question from Daniel.
Is Jameson in this sandbox in MELD?
No, not at this time.
Okay, that was a little tongue in cheek, but I was curious if he made it in. My main question asking that is, you know, as Ed, you sort of kicked us off on advanced directive, very clinical healthcare directed. How do we think about, or how do you think about, have you thought about MELD relative to the social care, education, justice kinds of data, including but not limited to structured data, but also unstructured data and narrative data? Is there any discussion around either of those things? I mean, let me rephrase. So when we think about, you know, again, from a healthcare perspective, makes complete sense. You know, their values, their, you know, numbers, there's measures, there's codes, there's stuff. Not as much on the social side. So when we're trying to potentially simulate, again, Thompson, Jameson, or whomever it might be, what's the applicability here? And how should we think about it, or how could we think about it going into the future in terms of simulating that, you know, a little bit more whole person kind of approach?
Daniel, that's a great question. I will say the team for MELD, the team's been focused on the healthcare side.
Sure.
Supporting some of the HL7 fire accelerators with their Connectathon events, the CMS Connectathon, the Global Digital Health Partnership, providing synthetic data and functionality for their vaccination passport initiative. And that's part of the reason that we wanted to present the demonstration today, because we are members of Project Unify and want to make sure the activities here advance.
Cool. You know, I'm thinking in particular also around wait a second. CDS LEAP, right? So you've got, I'm not sure about when you talk about CDS hooks, because I know that when we discussed that, and Mohammed, when he presented, and
those are separate, two separate things.
Okay, two separate things. Okay.
CDS hooks, a way to interface with medical record systems. CDS LEAP or LEAP CDS, a whole code base, which Oliver's pulled already into MELD, but that's with Dwayne and Mohammed and those guys.
So what's the connection to that? Only in that, in our discussions since Mohammed and Dwayne presented, and we've just discussed with them, how, because CDS LEAP did not go into anything outside of the healthcare space, although it looked like, and Brian help me here, looked like it was setting it up to be able to do that, applying I'm not sure what parts of it, to be able to take us into that, you know, that whole person social side of the equation.
I think that that LEAP CDS, the CDS portion was intended to be deacronized as consent decision services.
Right.
And CDS hooks is clinical decision support hooks, I believe.
Brian is correct, yes.
We live in a sea of acronyms, so sometimes I get lost in it. But what's interesting is that LEAP CDS, the the consent decision services does in fact, or in the architecture, it suggested that it does support CDS hooks as one of the mechanisms for interacting with an electronic health record system for determining whether or not the EHR has consent to display a particular piece of information to somebody playing a specific role. So
Yeah, and
just to make things complicated for the uninitiated.
right. And Brian, what about Daniel's question about social determinants and the extension into human services for the LEAP CDS product or code base?
This is obviously a question better posed to Mohammed or Dwayne. But my understanding is that my limited understanding, let me emphasize before Dan Chavez jumps on me, is that
you know he's going to do it. He turned the camera on.
while the architecture is designed to support, in addition to other types of consent, social services or SDOH consent, that I don't believe they actually got around to implementing the enforcement service for anything outside of an EHR. But with Gravity Project defining a large number of social determinants of health codes, it is perfectly reasonable to suggest that CDS is supporting the consent for the exchange of SDOH information if it happens to be SDOH information from an EHR as opposed to from a child welfare system, for example. And Dan, I yield to you to eviscerate me.
No, well done, Brian. Absolutely true. We did not have the money to add the fifth workflow, which was to support social services and a community information exchange. That was the intent. It was not part of the original requirements document. There were only the 4 requirements. The only thing I would add to what Brian said was that the overlap with CDS was for consent for treatment to make sure that got back into the EHR. So that's kind of the point that I think Brian might have skipped, but otherwise he was absolutely correct.
I was off a little bit, but I'm glad to know that my tea leaf reading skills have not gone completely.
And if I can just interject, I think the good news is that Oliver's got that code base loaded up in the MELD. So if we want to work with that there to further develop it or whatever, however we end up going, there's at least a platform to work from.
So to add to the conversation about SDOH, I mean, if one were to move in, let's say, the direction of implementing what the Gravity Project is doing, it would be a matter of just making sure you're supporting the latest US CDI, data elements and able to swap out and in various length and SNOMED codes. So it shouldn't be, it's more a matter of defining, what is the scenario and use case than any kind of, substantive implementation challenge, as I would imagine. But any of the presenters can correct me. I don't know. I guess I'll turn that into a question. What are your future plans in terms of like where you would first dip your feet into SDOH? And there was, first, you're doing very exciting work. There was the mention of the word, use of the word marketplace. Did you mean that there would be some kind of, it's open source, but then there would be some kind of freemium or paid model on top for additional services, or maybe filling out what you meant by marketplace?
So a couple of really good questions there, Matt. First on Gravity and SDOH. I participate on Gravity Strategic Advisory Council, and Brian, I know you're on their technical advisory group. as well. They're aware of MELD. We've had some conversations about utilizing it for the Gravity Connect-a-thons. Kind of interesting because to date, really looking at increasing participation in those activities and those with solutions, opening up their APIs to be able to really fully enable the Connect-a-thon activity, updating the implementation guide and the reference implementation for Interoperability Institute, since we're couched within the HIEs, to be able to enable reference implementation for Gravity on the MELD sandbox. So that's the future plan, but sort of that first next step. But as we know on Project Unify, we want to focus beyond Gravity, and I think enormously powerful bringing in some of not just what was done with the CBS LEAP, but looking at some of the utilities that we've done under the proof of concept for the humans, being able to enable interoperability on that front. And Gravity could become a really important community to engage with. Does that address your question, Matt? And then
Yeah, sure.
the second,
Yeah,
yeah, so-
if I may, I think you have to be real careful because it's a little bit confusing. When we talk about interoperability of SDOH data, that's one thing. When we talk about interoperability of getting consent for social services and CBOs, that's another. And they're not necessarily the same. They're different workflows. It's different interoperability. And so Mary, for me, because maybe I got a little confused in the presentation, I believe you're going to support both.
Correct. And Dan, as always, spot on. That's where the engagement with the BPM Plus community to actually build the process. There will be one for the healthcare side, SDOH Gravity, a separate model for some of the human services. Where it gets interesting is now, where do those come together? And as we look across those business processes to begin to model out what those scenarios are, so that in the sandbox environment, we can build that implementation, that proof of concept. We can fail, we can, through this group, address many of the very, very hard challenges in that space.
Yeah, arguably there are three workflows in this stream. There's the identity workflow, there's a consent workflow, there's a share SDOH data, consolidate, aggregate SDOH data workflow. All three separate, worthy of the sandbox testing as a proof of concept.
Excellent insight. Thank you, Dan. Matt, I think you had a second question around the private lockers and creating basically a marketplace for a hosted sandbox service. That's fairly straightforward. And that's where Interoperability Institute is positioning our interoperability land offering. It is a hosted service, a turnkey sandbox solution for private use, where entities may not, may have an activity that is not appropriate, or for their business process, it's not an activity in the public domain.
One other question for you. Are you planning on, are you open to supporting direct trust protocols like direct secure messaging?
Absolutely. We are a member of Direct Trust via the Michigan Health Information Network. And XDR, where to begin? But the short answer is yes, Brian. Great question. The Direct Trust framework, very, very important. And I do see that, is Jim from Lumetic still on? Because Jim, I know you have a lot of expertise in this area of identity management.
Jim from Lumetic is no longer on, but Jim from Linux Foundation Public Health is on.
Thank you for that clarification, Jim.
Mary missed that part of the conversation. Yeah.
That's okay. I was going to email Mary and Stephanie because we haven't chatted since HIMSS anyways, and a great opportunity to catch up. But with that being said, I could still offer a shameless plug that all of Lematics technology is based on open source decentralized identity solutions from Linux Foundation in Hyperledger, and it is certainly my intent to continue to pursue from an open source basis, leveraging digital identity into that. And of course, that's something I've been talking a lot with Project Unify about and talk with you, Mary. So that would be an excellent area to explore.
That's great to hear.
Excellent.
Hey, I had a question. We were, Dan, I think you were talking about the two thoughts. One, there's, sort of the 5 ONC pillar funding, and they didn't fund the 5th one, which was all about social services interaction. I'm curious, I know we addressed this to a certain degree, and I think you reminded us of this, or actually might have even said something in the scan report. We talk about I think it's in Houston, there's another LEAP initiative, another one of them. And then also, I think there's another, Ed Kowalski was talking with folks either in Oklahoma or Missouri that also got another LEAP grant. I'm wondering, having read about the one in Houston, it sounded like they had no recollection or no knowledge of the San Diego LEAP one in terms of what they were doing, but I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, Daniel, it's actually in Austin.
Austin, right.
At Dell Medical School. And they are informed with what's going on in San Diego.
Good.
Yeah.
Are they building beyond that? Are they have it in their sights to go that 5th area that they didn't do in San Diego?
Well, the focus of that particular LEAP grant is social determinants of health.
Okay.
And we should invite Dr. Anjum Kurjud to present to us from Dell Medical School. I'm happy to reach out to Anjum. In fact, I saw him a couple of weeks ago here in San Diego at EMEA. So that'd be worthwhile, Daniel, to have him present to this group. Just let me know when, and I'll reach out to Anjum.
Fantastic, Daniel. That's wonderful. I know from a timing perspective, I think we have one more call next week, and then we will break for Thanksgiving on the 25th. I'm gone on the 2nd. But I know people want to meet, so we may do the 2nd, 9th, and 16th of December. Maybe not the 16th. I know we're trying to do this consent. If this works and it makes sense, what Adam mentioned earlier, we wanted to try to schedule at least an initial scan orientation webinar, high level, sometime in the middle of the week of December there. Around the 15th, 16th, or 17th. So there may be too many activities right before the holidays, but maybe early December would be a perfect timing to hear about that. If it works, if not, then we just push it into, assuming we're back in full operation in January, we can do that.
Happy to support.
Thanks, Dan. Good to hear, Amber. Thank you. I'm glad to know that the Thompsons are still kicking.
So I know that we're at time. I want to thank you, Daniel, for providing us with the opportunity to present Project Unify. Thank you to everyone for the great questions and interaction. And my hope is that this is the beginning and the continuance of supporting Project Unify, but potentially seeing some convergence with Ed's for the electronic consent community of practice utilizing MELD, the synthetic personas, Project Unify, utilizing the same resources, presents an interesting opportunity to look at where we might find further synergies.
Fantabulous. That's great. So I know we're into actually double overtime. So any comments, questions people want to make, thoughts?
I had one quick question, sort of overtime. This is kind of personally oriented, but Mary, I reached out to the VPN Plus Health team a week or two ago to kind of follow up and say, hey, what's going on? I haven't heard anything since the e-consent meetings in HIMSS. And Sean emailed me back, and I also reached out to Ben. I was just wondering what's going on the BPM Plus Health side.
So on the BP health side, actually, Ed and I have been putting some conversation together. Essentially, it's putting forward that membership petition for standing up the community of practice, and then re-engaging with the BPM Plus, looking at potentially an event. That could be an interesting event with the group here for Project Unify to join in that activity, particularly with Brian mentioning the direct trust framework, some of the identity management challenges, Jim, but it's just a matter of time and capacity at this point.
Yeah, got it.
And Jim, this is Ed. I was just, before this call, I was just on a work group call with the BPM Plus team. So as Mary says, we're actively involved with them, and we could sidebar a further discussion about that, but we look forward to working more closely with them and standing up some real examples of how those workflows function.
That'd be great, Ed. And I'm sorry, I don't think I might have included you on the response I had back, but it was good to hear that. So thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for the question, Jim.
Thanks much. One other thing I just would mention, Dr. McCoy, who has been a regular participant of these calls and certainly a stalwart support and participant of Unify and NAA for the last couple of years, and a great colleague, is stepping back for a while in New Jersey. Some of you may have heard she has something many people face, are aging parents who are no longer able to, be on their own. So she's helping that transition and closing down the house and handling family stuff, which is just incredibly overwhelming, I'm sure, for her. And they're in Sacramento, been there for a long time. So she's stepping back for a while, hopes to re-engage in the new year, and but wants to send her, sends her salutations and greetings, and letting people know that, life has taken over the agenda for a while, other parts of life, which is not unreasonable by any means. For those of you who are going through that or have gone through that, I'm sure you can empathize with that. So, but on the upside, so to speak, that's not the way I wanted to say it. I've spoken with her co-PI, Dr. Steve Carries, who's part of Hackensack Meridian, more closely aligned with there as a clinical practitioner on the Inc. site in New Jersey. And we actually had a really good introductory call today, and I gave him a broad overview of where we're at, what we've been doing with New Jersey and Inc. and Unify and Consent and all of the many of the things that we're thinking about and working towards. And he's really interested in participating, and they're in the midst now of sort of with Christine gone, sort of recalibrating, sort of managing CMMI's expectations at the end of the year, going forward into 2022. They're in the implementation mode, them and the Bronx. I know that Kathy and Paul Meisner from Inc. New York and from Montefiore are not on today. We have spoken to them earlier about this work and developments and moving forward on POC, both in the Bronx and the POC in New Jersey. So I wanted to share that because those are, those doors are wide open, and an informed participant and colleague there. So that will be continuing to develop. I've invited them to participate, and we know others who are involved with them have been on the calls recently. So with all of that together, we'll wrap up today. See everyone next week. When we do send stuff out, do spend a little time thinking about how you can put your stone into the stone soup in terms of dissemination, and we should be all excited and have a great rest of the evening, everybody. Be good, be well, be happy.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks,
Daniel.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.